The laughter started the moment she walked onto the range. 22 years old, 5'4", a civilian in a sea of decorated soldiers. No combat patches. No unit insignia. Just a quiet girl from a Montana ranch who had no business being there. Then she pulled the trigger. One shot, one target, dead center at a distance that had made grown men sweat. The laughter died instantly. What happened next at Red Canyon Precision Academy over the following 8 weeks would be talked about in military circles for years. A story about the one they all underestimated, and the price every single one of them paid for it. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, because this one will leave you speechless. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. The drive into Red Canyon took 40 minutes on a road that barely deserved the name. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through high desert scrub, climbing steadily until the surrounding terrain opened into a broad plateau ringed by sandstone formations. The kind of country that looked peaceful from a distance and punished you the moment you stopped paying attention. Thin air, hard sun, wind that came from 3 directions at once and committed to none of them. Emily Carter had driven the route twice before. Once to submit her application packet in person because she didn't trust the mail. Once for the preliminary screening, which she had passed without fanfare, quietly, the way she did most things. Now she sat in the passenger seat of a government transport van with 7 other candidates, her range bag wedged between her boots, watching the plateau appear through the windshield like something slowly rising out of the earth. She was the youngest person in the vehicle, the only woman, the only one who hadn't worn a uniform at some point in their life. Nobody spoke to her directly for the first 30 minutes. That was fine. She was used to it. Red Canyon Precision Academy operated under a joint training initiative between 3 branches of the armed forces and a federal law enforcement consortium whose name most people would never recognize. The facility existed on paper as a regional marksmanship development center. What it actually produced were snipers, the kind who got called when a situation had already burned past every other option. The 8-week certification course accepted 32 candidates per cycle. Historically, fewer than half finished. Of those who finished, fewer than a third earned a qualifying score. No civilian had ever completed the program. Emily knew all of this. She had read every publicly available piece of information about the academy 3 times over, and she had requested, and received, after a 2-month wait, a copy of the redacted curriculum overview through a Freedom of Information filing. She had cross-referenced the training benchmarks against Army Sniper School standards, Marine Scout Sniper Doctrine, and FBI HRT selection criteria. She had not done any of this to impress anyone. She had done it because she needed to know what she was walking into. The transport van rolled through the main gate at 0643. A staff sergeant with a clipboard checked names against a manifest without looking up, waved them through, and they parked in a gravel lot beside a low cinder block building that smelled of gun oil and old coffee. The other candidates climbed out and immediately began the silent assessment process that soldiers do instinctively, reading each other's patches, bearing, age, the way someone carried their gear. Emily pulled her bag from between her feet and stepped onto the gravel and felt the eyes land on her like something physical. She set her bag down and stretched her lower back. Let the eyes do what they needed to do. "You're in the wrong lot." The voice came from her left. She turned. He was maybe 30, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of tan that came from years outside rather than a week on a beach. His name tape read Pierce. He had a Special Forces combat diver tab on his left sleeve and the posture of someone who had never seriously doubted himself. "Civilian contractor lot is about a quarter-mile east," he said, not unkindly, more like someone giving directions to a tourist. "I'm a candidate," Emily said. He looked at her for a moment, then at her bag, then back at her face. "You know what this course is? 8 weeks, precision long-range marksmanship, environmental shooting, fieldcraft, terminal ballistics, stalking exercises. Final evaluation at variable distance. Current record is 1,600 meters. She kept her voice level. "I read the overview." Pierce studied her with an expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite contempt. Something in between, with a thin layer of curiosity underneath that he was working to suppress. "Huh," he said, and turned away. But the The first formation brought all 32 candidates together on the central parade ground at 700 sharp. Chief Warrant Officer Dale Hatch addressed them from the steps of the main building, hands clasped behind his back, voice carrying easily through the dry mountain air. Hatch was 51 and looked it in the best possible way, not worn out, just hardened to the point where nothing unnecessary remained. He had spent 23 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment before transitioning to instruction, and he had the reputation of a man who had seen every kind of candidate and couldn't be surprised by any of them. He scanned the formation without lingering on anyone. "You're here because someone decided you were worth the cost of the ammunition," he said. "That assessment may or may not be accurate. We'll find out. This program does not care about your record, your branch, your unit, or your opinion of yourself. The only thing that matters is what you do on this range under these conditions. You will be assessed objectively and scored accordingly. Any questions about your position in the ranking will be answered by the scorecard, not by me." He paused. "Get your kit squared away. Range brief in 2 hours. Dismissed." The formation broke and Emily felt it again. The way people naturally angled away from her as they moved toward the barracks. Not hostility, exactly. More like the mild social recalibration that happens when someone doesn't fit the expected pattern, and nobody's decided yet how to file them away. A woman named Reeves fell into step beside her. Short cropped hair, a military police insignia on her collar. She had the careful eyes of someone who'd spent time reading crowds. "Carter, right? I'm Sergeant First Class Dana Reeves. Don't mind Pierce. He ranks everyone this first day and takes about a week to recalibrate when he's wrong." "He wasn't wrong to question it," Emily said. "Nobody's done this course as a civilian. The skepticism makes sense." Reeves glanced at her sideways. "Most people who've been dismissed all their life get a little more defensive about it." Emily thought about her grandfather's ranch, about lying motionless in tall grass for 4 hours watching a mule deer family move through a tree line, learning to silence the part of her brain that demanded action. About the patience required not to pull the trigger until the wind, the angle, and the light all agreed. "Defensive doesn't help you shoot straight," she said. But the first range session was a baseline evaluation. No pressure, Hatch told them, just data collection. The academy needed to know where each candidate started. The firing positions had been set at 300, 500, and 800 meters. The candidates shot in rotation, 5 rounds each position, scores logged by instructors who communicated via radio in brief, clipped exchanges. "Bravo 4, ready. Send it." The reports came in sharp and flat against the surrounding terrain, each crack followed by the faint distant ping of steel or the soft thump of a miss. 300 meters was manageable for most of them. 500 started separating the consistent shooters from the ones relying on luck. 800 began applying pressure in earnest, and Emily watched from her waiting position as candidates who had seemed relaxed 40 minutes ago started showing the small tells, the tight jaw, the grip adjusted too many times, the barrel that drifted slightly left as the breathing went wrong. When her number was called, she walked to the firing line without urgency. She settled in behind the rifle, a standard-issue precision bolt action in .308, nothing exotic, the kind of platform that showed you exactly what the shooter was doing and rewarded no shortcuts. She ran a brief bolt check, confirmed the chamber, made 2 small adjustments to the scope's position relative to her eye, and went still. Not performance still, actually still. Breathing, present, waiting for everything inside her to quiet down. At 300 meters, she shot a 5-round group that would have fit under a silver dollar. Nobody said anything, but she heard the change in the ambient noise around the observation tower. The small shift that happens when people who weren't paying attention start paying attention. At 500 meters, her group opened slightly, still centered, still inside any reasonable standard. At 800 meters, she missed her first shot by approximately 6 inches, left. She noted the wind had shifted 17 degrees between the time the candidate before her had fired and the time she pulled the trigger. She adjusted her hold, took a breath, released half of it, and fired 4 times. All 4 rounds center mass. The radio crackled from the observation tower. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone told her something had changed. She stood, cleared the weapon, and walked back to the waiting line. Pierce was watching her from the far end of the line with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the tourist directions look from the parking lot. Something different. something he was trying to decide whether to acknowledge or not. He chose not to. He turned back toward the range. That was fine too. Dinner that evening was served in a low-ceilinged mess hall that smelled of industrial coffee and reconstituted gravy. Emily sat at the end of a table with Reeves and two Army Rangers named Castillo and Webb, who had apparently known each other from a previous assignment and communicated mostly in half-sentences and references she didn't have context for. Nobody brought up the range results directly, but she felt the current of it moving through the room. Pierce was eating with a group of 5 candidates at a table near the window. They talked loud enough to be heard without quite loud enough to be quoted. She caught her name once, and the phrase beginner's luck, and decided that was about as predictable as gravity. "They're going to do this all week," Reeves said quietly, not looking up from her tray. "I know." "Doesn't bother you?" Emily picked up her coffee. It was bad coffee, weak and slightly sour, the kind of coffee that existed purely for the caffeine. She drank it anyway. "When I was 15, my grandfather took me on a week-long elk hunt in the back country," she said. "No roads. We packed in 8 miles. He told me on the second morning that the mountain didn't care what I thought about myself. The elk didn't care. The wind didn't care. The only thing that mattered was whether I was paying attention." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "Did you get the elk?" At 412 yards in 30-knot gusts, quartering away shot through the right lung, she set down the coffee. "My grandfather cried a little, pretended he had something in his eye." Reeves stared at her. Then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "Carter," she said, "I think you're going to be a problem for a lot of people in this building." The first 2 weeks established a rhythm. Physical training before dawn, classroom instruction in wind reading, ballistics, target identification, and observation protocols through the morning, live fire in the afternoon, field exercises in the evening that frequently ran well past dark, sleep in 4 to 6 hour windows that never quite felt like enough. The physical demands were harder than Emily had expected, not because she was unfit, but because the particular kind of endurance required: sustained stillness, deliberate slow movement carrying significant weight, hours of focused observation without allowing attention to drift, used muscle groups and mental pathways that weren't built by conventional training. Her lower back ached constantly for the first 10 days. Her elbows, which bore most of her weight in the prone position, developed bruises that bloomed through every shade between yellow and purple. She didn't mention any of this to anyone. On the 9th day, one of the rangers, Webb, the quieter of the two, sat down beside her during a map study session and spread his own notes next to hers without asking. "You're doing the wind calculation the long way," he said. "Your math is right, but you're adding steps. There's a shortcut for the 15-degree conversion." She looked at his notes. He was right. "Thanks," she said. "You walked that ridgeline during the dawn observation exercise on Tuesday. Picked up the position of all 4 instructors inside 40 minutes. He didn't make it a question. 47 minutes, she said. "I was slow. The fastest anyone else finished was 2 hours 12. He tapped his pencil against the table once. "I grew up hunting in Wyoming. I know what that kind of patience looks like. It's not something they teach in the classroom." He went back to his notes. She went back to hers. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was something. The stalking exercise came at the end of week 2, and it hit the candidates like a wall. The premise was simple enough in theory. Each candidate had to move from a designated start point, cross 400 meters of open terrain and sparse scrub, and come within 100 yards of an instructor station without being detected. The instructors were equipped with high magnification spotting scopes, thermal imaging units, and a communication network that allowed them to vector each other toward any movement. 2/3 of the candidates were spotted within the first 40 minutes. Emily watched them get called out one by one from her position flat against the ground in a shallow depression 40 meters from the start line, where she had spent the first 20 minutes doing nothing but watching. Not crawling, not advancing, watching. The instructors had a pattern. Small habits visible in where they directed their scopes first, how they communicated, which sectors they trusted and which ones they kept returning to because something nagged at them. Every person has a tell. Every observation protocol has a gap. She began to move. Not quickly. Never quickly. The way water moves, finding the low points, following the natural lie of the terrain, becoming part of the texture of the ground rather than something moving across it. Her ghillie suit had been modified from the issued standard, with local vegetation woven in over the previous 2 days, selected specifically from the plant species present in the exercise area. The color match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough in the right light. She moved 30 meters in 40 minutes. Then she stopped and waited for a cloud to shift across the sun. When the light changed, she moved again. Hatch was standing at the observation point when she rose from a patch of scrub brush 93 yards from the instructor station, 3 hours and 11 minutes after the exercise began. She stood up slowly, brushed a beetle off her sleeve, and watched him stare at her for a long moment. Behind him, 3 instructors with spotting scopes had been scanning the field for the last hour. None of them had seen her coming. "How long were you in the 100-meter perimeter?" Hatch asked. 40 minutes, approximately. "You could have taken the shot." "At least twice," she said. "I wanted to make sure the approach was clean first." He looked at her. She couldn't read what was behind it. Surprise, maybe, or the careful reassessment of someone reclassifying data. "Go get Chow," he said. That evening, Pierce found her outside the barracks, sitting on a wooden bench cleaning her rifle in the last of the daylight. He sat down at the far end of the bench without asking. She kept running the patch through the bore and didn't look up. "Where'd you train?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I didn't. Not formally." A silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of wind moving through the canyon. "My grandfather," she said without him asking. "He was a cattle rancher in Montana. We started tracking together when I was about 7, started shooting seriously when I was 9. He had a way of teaching that wasn't really teaching. He'd just take me out and let me figure out what I was doing wrong by watching what happened." Pierce was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather taught me to box," he said finally. "I thought it was the hardest thing I'd ever learn." A short pause. "Then I went to selection." She looked up at him then. He wasn't apologizing exactly. Special Forces operators rarely apologize directly. It's not in the architecture of how they communicate. But there was something in the way he was sitting on the bench, slightly turned toward her, that said he was revising an earlier assessment. "The course gets harder," he said. "I know. 1,200 meters in week 6, environmental, variable wind from 2 directions." "I've been reading the terrain since we got here," she said. "The canyon creates a channeling effect in the afternoon that deflects the prevailing wind about 12 degrees northeast. The mirage above the range reads about 3 to 4 miles per hour, faster than actual surface wind. There's a temperature inversion in the early morning that affects bullet drop calculations by approximately half a MOA at 1,100 meters. Pierce stared at her. "You figured that out in 2 weeks," he said. "I've been walking it every morning before PT." She set down the cleaning rod. "The mountain doesn't care who I am. It just asks whether I've been paying attention." He stood up, adjusted his cap, looked out at the canyon for a moment. "Carter," he said. "Yeah. Don't miss the 1,200 shot." He walked back toward the barracks. She picked up the cleaning rod and went back to work. Across the range, the last light faded out of the sky in long horizontal bars of orange and rust, and the canyon filled slowly with shadow, and somewhere in the middle distance something rustled briefly in the brush and went still again, the way everything alive eventually does out here, when it finally learns to be patient. The wind shifted once, carrying a smell of juniper and distant rain. She noted it, filed it away. She was paying attention. Then her radio crackled, and the voice on the other end belonged to Hatch, and what he said in 7 words stopped her cold. "Carter, briefing room, bring your qualification file." The briefing room was a windowless rectangle at the back of the main building, lit by 2 overhead fluorescent tubes, one of which had been flickering for what looked like several weeks without anyone deciding to fix it. A folding table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with the ghost of a previous diagram still visible under a thin coat of dry erase cleaner. Hatch was already inside when she arrived, sitting on the edge of the table rather than behind it, arms crossed, studying something in a manila folder. He didn't look up immediately when she came in. She stood near the door and waited. He closed the folder. "Sit down, Carter." She sat, set her qualification file on the table between them. He didn't touch it. "You want to tell me who you are?" he said. It wasn't the opening she had expected. She kept her expression neutral. "The file's right there." "I read the file 2 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. Emily Carter, 22. No military service. No formal marksmanship training program on record. No competitive shooting history. Address listed as Rural Route 9, Ravalli County, Montana. He paused. "What I want to know is how a 22-year-old with no institutional training background reads terrain the way you read terrain, how she moves the way you move today. Because what I watched out there this afternoon doesn't come from hunting elk with your grandfather." The fluorescent tube flickered once. "It comes partly from that," she said. "Partly." She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. "My grandfather wasn't just a rancher. He did 2 tours in Vietnam, long-range reconnaissance patrol. He didn't talk about it much, but he taught the way people teach, when something has been burned deep enough that it becomes reflex instead of memory. We weren't just hunting animals. We were moving like he'd moved in the jungle, low, slow, patient, watching everything." She paused. "He died when I was 17. By then, most of it was already in me." Hatch was quiet. "Why this program?" he said. "Because it's the best one that exists, and I wanted to know how far I could actually go." Most people who want to know that join the military. "I thought about it." She kept her voice even. "I applied to this program instead. The criteria didn't restrict civilian applicants. I met the criteria." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense he was deciding something, though she couldn't tell what. "The other candidates think you got lucky on the baseline eval," he said. "Some of the instructors do too. Week 3 gets harder. Week 4 is where we start losing people in quantity." He picked up the folder and stood. "I'm not going to tell you to prove yourself, because that's not how this program works. But I want you to understand that the accommodation level here is 0. You fall behind the standard, you're gone." "I know." "One more thing." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Pierce put in a formal question about your admission to the program. Procedural grounds. He's claiming the civilian exception wasn't properly documented." She felt something tighten in her chest, but only briefly. "Is the documentation in order?" "Yes." A thin pause. "I handled it, but you should know it happened." He left. She sat in the flickering light for a while and looked at nothing in particular. Then she picked up her qualification file and went to bed. Martian. Week 3 opened with something the program called environmental pressure sequencing, which was an official-sounding name for the systematic application of conditions designed to degrade performance. Cold, fatigue, uncertainty, noise, sensory interference introduced during live fire, position changes without warning, multiple simultaneous demands on attention. The idea was to remove every comfortable variable and find out what remained. What remained, in Emily's case, was the same thing that had been there at the start. A quietness that wasn't emotional distance, but something more structural, more load-bearing. The first cold weather evolution ran for 18 hours straight. Night temperatures dropped to 22 degrees. Candidates were required to maintain observation posts in the open terrain with a 4-hour sleep rotation that never quite materialized because the exercise objectives kept shifting. By hour 14, people were making errors they wouldn't have made in the first hour. Misidentifying targets, miscommunicating coordinates, losing track of their position in the darkness. Emily made 2 small errors of her own. She wasn't above it. The cold got into her fingers in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she fumbled a magazine exchange during a timed drill, losing 4 seconds that cost her 3 position points on the scorecard. She noted it, filed it, adjusted her hand-warming protocol. But she didn't fall apart. Others did. A former Marine named Garrett had been one of the steadier candidates through week 2. Experienced, disciplined, the kind of shooter who scored consistently, even if not spectacularly. By hour 15 of the cold weather evolution, he was sitting in the wrong observation sector, arguing with his spotter about a coordinate that neither of them had right, voice climbing into a register that had nothing to do with calm, tactical communication. 047, I said 047. Why are you writing 05? I've got 047 right here. Then why does it look like a 5? Because your handwriting looks like a 4. Emily was 15 meters away in her own position, and she didn't say anything. It wasn't her call to make. The instructors monitoring the evolution would document it. What she did instead was check her own coordinate sheet for the 4th time that night. Not because she doubted it, because checking 4 times at -6 degrees in the dark was still less expensive than being wrong once. The classroom sessions in week 3 moved into terminal ballistics and the mathematics of long-range precision shooting in ways that began to leave some candidates behind. The physics involved: external ballistics, atmospheric density, Coriolis effect at extreme range, spin drift, the way a bullet's behavior shifted between subsonic and transonic flight, required a particular kind of thinking that not everyone in the room had. Emily had the math. More than that, she had a habit that the instructors noticed, though they said nothing about it directly. She always tied the calculation back to something observable. Not just the numbers on the Kestrel weather meter, but the way the grass was moving in the middle distance, the behavior of a hawk riding the thermal above the range, the particular quality of shimmer above the steel target that told you the air density was different from what the instruments were reading. A young instructor named Vasquez, mid-20s, Army, with the narrow-eyed focus of someone perpetually doing math, started lingering near her position during the observation sessions. Not to help, to watch. She caught him at it on the 3rd day. "Something wrong with my form," she said, not looking up from the spotting scope. "No." A pause. "I'm trying to figure out how you're reading the mirage that way." "Which way?" "You called the wind shift 4 seconds before the Kestrel updated. Twice." She was quiet for a moment, tracking the heat shimmer across the range floor through the scope. "The mirage boils when it's calm and leans when it's moving," she said. "The direction it leans tells you the wind direction. The speed it leans tells you velocity, roughly. It's faster than the instrument because you're reading it in real time instead of waiting for the sensor cycle." She paused. "My grandfather called it reading the air. It's not mystical, it's just practice." Vasquez crouched beside her firing position, looking out toward the range. He was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you get that much practice?" "Montana." "How much time behind the scope?" She thought about it honestly. "Since I was 9, regularly. Thousands of hours. Maybe more." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because what you just described, using mirage to read wind in real time, we teach that in week 5. Advanced Environmental Module. I've had candidates who've been shooting competitively for 10 years who still can't do it reliably." She looked back through the scope. "Then maybe the course should teach it earlier," she said. He stared at her for another second. Then he stood and walked back toward the observation post without another word. She wasn't sure if she'd offended him. She hadn't meant to. It was just the first answer that came to mind. Pierce had gone quiet. Not hostile quiet. More like a man recalculating in the background, running new numbers against an old model, not ready to publish the result yet. He still moved through the program with the easy authority of someone who had spent years being the best person in most rooms. But there were moments now, brief, carefully controlled, where she caught him watching the scorecard on the main board with an expression that wasn't comfortable. The ranking was posted daily. Emily had been in the top 5 since the baseline JSOC evaluation. By the middle of week 3, she was 3rd overall, behind a Marine Master Sergeant named Donnelly and a Border Patrol tactical agent named Ferreira, who had been shooting long-range competition for 6 years. Pierce was 7th. She didn't watch him discover it on the board. She heard about it secondhand from Reeves, who had been standing nearby. "He stared at it for about 10 seconds, Reeves told her that evening. "Didn't say anything, just walked away." "He'll adjust," Emily said. "You're not angry at him." "For what?" "For the documentation complaint, for the parking lot, for all of it." Emily thought about her grandfather walking her through the same patch of timber for the 4th consecutive morning, patient as stone, saying nothing while she figured out what she'd been doing wrong the previous 3 times. Anger takes energy, she said. I need the energy for other things. Reeves shook her head slowly. I genuinely cannot decide if you're the most well-adjusted person I've ever met, or if you're just running on a frequency the rest of us can't hear. Emily almost smiled. Probably some of both. Week 4 announced itself with a briefing that went longer than usual and left the remaining candidates quieter than they'd been at any point in the course. The program was introducing a new element, team stalking assessments, where pairs of candidates would be evaluated together on movement, communication, and joint target engagement. Performance would be scored collectively, meaning one person's failure affected both scores. The pairings were assigned, not chosen. Emily's partner was Pierce. She found out the same moment he did, both of them reading the assignment board simultaneously, him on her left with about 8 inches of space between them that felt somehow charged. She looked at the board. He looked at the board. She stepped back to give him room to read more clearly, and he did the same. And for a moment they both stepped back simultaneously, and neither of them acknowledged it. Well, he said finally. Yeah, she said. He looked at her sideways. Something shifted in his face, not warmth exactly, but the removal of a layer of defensiveness that had been sitting there since the parking lot. I put in that documentation complaint because I thought you'd been admitted through a political exception, he said. I want you to know that. I know why you put it in. I was wrong about the reason. She looked at him. Was the documentation actually in order? Hatch showed me the original admission review. It was clean. He paused. You earned the spot. She nodded once, looked back at the board. The stalking assessment is in 3 days, she said. We should run the terrain together before then. Yeah. He pulled out his notepad. I was thinking the same thing. It wasn't an apology, but it was something real, which she respected more than an apology would have been. They ran the terrain the following morning before PT, moving through the scrub in the gray pre-dawn light without speaking much. Pierce moved well. Better than she'd expected, actually, with a ground-eating efficiency that came from thousands of miles of operational movement. He was fast in ways she wasn't. She was patient in ways he wasn't. It became clear within the first 20 minutes that they were going to have to negotiate those differences. You stop too often, he said, after she went motionless for 3 minutes watching a pair of magpies move through a section of brush ahead of them. The birds are telling me something. We're not hunting birds. The birds are telling me there's someone in that section of brush. She kept her voice flat. Or there was recently. Magpies don't move that way unless something disturbed them. He looked at the birds, then at the brush, then back at her. Could be a deer, he said. Could be. She waited. Or it could be Vasquez running an early observation post, which is what I think it is. They waited another 90 seconds. Then the brush shifted and Vasquez emerged from beneath a gilly veil, looked up, and saw them both standing at the edge of the terrain 30 meters away. His expression was the specific expression of someone who has been caught at something. How? He said. The magpies, Emily said. Vasquez looked at the birds, who had already lost interest and moved on. Then he looked at her. Then he made a note in his pad and disappeared back into the brush, possibly to be annoyed in private. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay, I'll stop moving when you stop moving. He looked at her. But if we get to the final pair assessment, and I think we're burning time, I'm going to tell you. Good, she said. I'll tell you the same thing. They moved on through the gray light, two very different kinds of hunter learning the shape of each other's instincts. The team stalking assessment ran for 6 hours and produced the highest combined score of any pair in the evolution, which surprised everyone except possibly Reeves, who said she'd seen it coming and collected $12 from Castillo on the basis of a bet made the morning the pairings were announced. But the score didn't matter as much as what happened during hour 4, when the evolution's conditions shifted and the instructors introduced a live fire component that hadn't been in the briefing document. Emily and Pierce were 300 meters into their final approach when the radio crackled with a scenario update. A simulated high-value target had appeared at the objective, and the team was required to take an immediate precision shot from their current position before the window closed. Their current position was partially exposed. Not ideal. The range to the target was 460 meters, which was manageable, but the wind had picked up in the last 20 minutes and was coming across at a significant angle from the left, gusting irregular between 8 and 14 miles per hour. "I'm taking it," Pierce said immediately, already settling behind his rifle. Emily put her hand on his arm. Not grabbing, just contact, brief, deliberate. "Wait," she said quietly. "Window's closing. The gust is cycling every 40 to 45 seconds. We've been in this position for 3 minutes. I've been tracking it. There's a 3-second lull at the top of each cycle." She looked at him steadily. "Wait 8 seconds. Then shoot." He looked at her. She could see the resistance in him, the operator's instinct to act, to take the shot, to trust his own read on the conditions. 8 seconds is a long time when a clock is running. 8 seconds, he repeated. "Yes." He looked downrange, back at her. Then he looked at the grass between them and the target, the way it was moving, the way it flattened and then rose and then flattened again in the gust cycle she'd been tracking. She watched him see it. He settled in, went still, let the gust push twice more through the grass while his breathing slowed. On the third flattening, when the air went briefly honest, he fired. The round hit the steel target dead center. The impact report came back across the distance half a second later, flat and definitive. Neither of them said anything for a moment. 8 seconds, he said finally. "Yeah." He ejected the case and pocketed it out of habit. She was already noting the wind's next cycle in her head, just in case. "Carter," he said. "Yeah." "Where did you learn to count a wind cycle like that?" She thought about a specific afternoon. She was maybe 13, lying in tall grass near a stock pond while her grandfather timed the gusts coming off the mountains with an old mechanical stopwatch, telling her to feel the rhythm in it the way you feel the rhythm in music before you try to play along. "Montana," she said, you keep saying that like it explains everything." "It explains more than you'd think." The radio crackled again with the scenario end signal, and around them the terrain went back to being what it always was, scrub and dust and the thin mountain air that gave nothing away for free. Week 5 brought the distances. 800 meters had been the baseline. Now they were shooting at 1,000, and the 1,000-meter shots were not where it stopped. The program extended to 1,100, 1,200, and a theoretical maximum of 1,600 that sat at the end of the course like something waiting. Not quite a threat, not quite a promise, just a fact about the future that everyone in the program was aware of at all times. At 1,000 meters, bullet flight time is over a second. A wind shift in the middle of that second can move the round enough to miss entirely. The shooter has to account for conditions that don't yet exist at the moment of the trigger pull, predicting the air the bullet will fly through rather than reading the air they can currently see. It requires a particular inversion of thinking, acting on future information using present signals, that takes some people months to develop. Emily had been doing it instinctively for years. What changed now was that she had to do it at distances and under pressures that tested the reliability of those instincts against hard physical limits. Her first shot at 1,000 meters hit the edge of the target. Not a miss, but barely not a miss. She marked it and said nothing to her spotter, Reeves for this evolution, and made the adjustment and hit the next 4 rounds inside the center ring. But she noted the first shot, replayed the moment, found the error. She'd rushed the trigger brake by about a quarter second, chasing a wind lull instead of waiting for it. That night, she wrote a single line in the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket. "Don't chase the window, let the window find you." Reeves read it over her shoulder while she was writing it. "That's either very wise or very obvious," Reeves said. "Probably both," Emily said. "The obvious things are usually the ones you have to relearn." The candidate pool was thinning. 32 had started. By the end of week 5, 19 remained. Some had withdrawn voluntarily. A decision that was always respected and never commented on publicly, because the physical and psychological load of the program was real, and withdrawing when you recognized your limits was, in Hatch's words during the first week orientation, not quitting, it's accurate self-assessment. Others had been administratively removed for scoring below the minimum threshold on back-to-back evaluations, a process that happened quietly and was reflected the following morning by an empty bunk and a name off the board. Garrett, the Marine from the cold weather evolution, was gone by week 4. 2 of the Army Rangers were gone. A DEA tactical agent named Ochoa who had seemed almost bulletproof through the first 3 weeks, developed a stress fracture in his left tibia on day 26 and was medically withdrawn. The 19 who remained had a different quality to them than the original 32. Not better, exactly. Just reduced to something more essential. The habits and instincts that actually held up under sustained pressure, as opposed to the ones that looked good in the first week. Emily felt it in herself too. The things she'd been uncertain about had either resolved into competence or revealed themselves as limits she was managing around. The things that had always been there, the patience, the environmental reading, the ability to go quiet inside when everything outside got loud, felt less like advantages now and more like the minimum required to stay in the building. Pierce was still in the program, 6th overall now, which meant he'd moved up 1 position since the team evolution. The scorecard reflected the things she'd seen during the 8-second moment on the stalking assessment, the willingness to update his model when the evidence pointed somewhere he hadn't expected. She respected that. It wasn't easy. For someone built the way Pierce was built, it probably cost something significant every single time. The Week 5 environmental module brought Vasquez back to the front of the classroom with a new set of calculations on the whiteboard and an expression that suggested he had been thinking about something for several days and had reached a conclusion he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Wind reading via mirage," he said. "Some of you have already encountered this concept informally." He didn't look at Emily. He very specifically did not look at Emily, which told her he very specifically was thinking about Emily. "We're going to spend 2 days on it because it is, in my assessment, one of the most undervalued skills in long-range precision shooting, and most programs introduce it too late." He paused. "I've adjusted the module timing for this cycle based on candidate performance data." Now he did look at her briefly. "If you're already practicing it, use these sessions to systematize what you know. If it's new to you, pay attention, because at 1,200 meters, the difference between reading the mirage correctly and not reading it correctly can be the difference between a hit and a miss by 3 feet. After the session, Reeves fell into step beside Emily on the way out. "Did he just redesign part of the curriculum?" Reeves said. "Because of you." "He redesigned it based on candidate performance data," Emily said. "Yeah, you're the candidate performance data." Emily didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it later, sitting on the bench outside the barracks in the last light of the afternoon, cleaning her rifle while the wind came through the canyon in its particular evening way. Low and consistent out of the northwest, dropping a few degrees in temperature as the sun went off the rocks. It made her uncomfortable, if she was honest. Not the recognition itself, but the way it created a target. Expectation was its own kind of pressure. When nobody expected anything from you, the only standard you had to meet was your own. When people started watching, the standard became something shared, something that existed partly in their eyes, and that was harder to manage than wind. She ran the bore brush through the chamber and thought about what week 6 would bring. 1,200 meters, variable environmental conditions, 2-direction wind. She'd been watching the canyon terrain all month. She knew where the thermals rose in the morning and where the afternoon wind bent around the eastern formation and came back at a different angle than it started with. She knew the temperature drop rate between the valley floor and the firing line elevation. She knew the particular behavior of the high plateau air when a weather system was building over the mountains to the west. A slight increase in density altitude that affected bullet drop calculations by a margin most shooters missed because they were checking their instruments instead of looking at the sky. She wasn't ready to say she had it figured out. The mountain didn't like it when you thought you had it figured out. But she was paying attention. She had been paying attention every single day since she arrived. And on the morning of week 6, when Hatch walked to the front of the briefing room with an expression that told the remaining 19 candidates that the difficulty level they'd been experiencing up to now was about to be reclassified as the easy part, she was as ready as she knew how to be. Which was not the same as ready. Nothing out here was ever the same as ready. It was just the best available answer to a question that the terrain kept asking differently every single day. She turned the rifle over in her hands, checked the action one more time, and set it down across her knees. Across the canyon, the last light dissolved off the rocks, and the stars came in cold and close, and the wind kept moving through it all the way it always had, patient and entirely indifferent, measuring everything against a standard that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations, including hers. The morning of week 6 came in hard. Not dramatic hard, no thunderstorm, no biblical wind event, nothing that would have given the remaining candidates an easy excuse. Just a flat gray sky pressing down on the plateau, and a temperature that had dropped 15 degrees overnight and stayed there. And a crosswind that Hatch's weather brief put at 12 to 18 miles per hour, with gusts to 24 coming from the northwest and deflecting off the eastern canyon wall into something unpredictable and inconsistent. The kind of conditions that didn't announce themselves as dangerous. They just quietly made everything harder and waited to see who noticed. 19 candidates, 1,200 meters, 2 days of evaluation. Emily stood at the edge of the firing line in the gray morning light and watched the range floor for a long time before anyone called the first relay. The grass moved in patterns she'd been studying for 5 weeks. The mirage above the distant steel target shimmered and leaned and shimmered again. She noted the interval between gusts, noted the way the deflection off the canyon wall added a secondary wind component at a slight upward angle, maybe 3 degrees elevation effect at 1,200, which most calculators wouldn't account for unless you knew to look for it. She wrote 2 numbers in her notebook, folded it back into her breast pocket. Reeves appeared at her left shoulder. "How's it reading?" Reeves said quietly. "Complicated." Emily kept watching the range. The deflection off the east wall is creating a secondary component that's going to push shots high right if people are only accounting for the primary wind vector. "You going to tell anyone?" A pause. "Vasquez will see it," she said. "He's been reading this range longer than any of us." She left the rest of that thought unspoken. Reeves understood it. If the instructors wanted the candidates briefed on it, they would brief them. If they didn't, it was probably because detecting secondary wind effects in canyon terrain was part of what was being assessed. The first relay was called at 0730. 6 candidates shot in the opening relay. Emily was in the second group and spent the first 40 minutes watching from the observation area with a spotting scope, logging every result she could see. Of the 6 shooters in Relay 1, 3 hit on their first shot, 2 required corrections, and 1, a DEA agent named Marsh who had been sitting at 11th on the board, missed the 1,200-meter plate entirely on all 5 rounds. Each shot tracking right of the target in a pattern that told Emily he was compensating for the primary wind vector only and the secondary deflection was pulling every round offline. Marsh stood up from his firing position, and she could see the shape of what was happening in him from 50 meters away. The jaw tight, the shoulders slightly raised, the way he looked at his spotter as if the spotter might have an answer that would make the previous 5 minutes not have happened. The spotter shook his head. Marsh pulled off his ear protection and walked to the rear of the firing line and stood there looking at nothing with his hands on his hips. Pierce was in Relay 1 as well. He hit on the second shot, adjusted, and put his next 4 inside the acceptable ring. It wasn't a spectacular performance, but it was solid and controlled, and it told her he'd identified the secondary component on his own, probably during the same pre-dawn terrain walk he'd been doing every morning since week 4. She wasn't surprised. He was good. She'd always known he was good. What had surprised her over the weeks was that he was better than his personality had initially suggested. More flexible, more genuinely interested in learning, less attached to being right than she'd first assumed. The parking lot version of Logan Pierce and the current version were related, but not identical. When he came back from the line, he stopped beside her. "Secondary deflection off the east wall," he said, not a question. "Yeah. Adds about 4 to 5 miles per hour effective crosswind at elevation. 3 to 4, depending on the gust cycle. Higher when it's gusting." He looked at her for a second. "How long have you been tracking it?" 3 weeks. He shook his head very slowly. Not negative, just the gesture of someone encountering a data point they're still assimilating. "You didn't say anything," he said. "You found it on your own." Marsh didn't. She looked at where Marsh was still standing at the back of the line. "No," she said. He didn't. Her relay was called at 0912. She carried her rifle to the firing point and settled in with the deliberate, unhurried quality that she'd learned from years of her grandfather watching her and saying nothing when she rushed and saying nothing when she didn't. The silence being its own instruction, teaching her to find the difference between those 2 states herself. Her spotter for the relay was Vasquez, which she hadn't expected. Instructors didn't usually spot for candidates during scored evolutions. She looked at him when he settled in behind the spotting scope beside her. Conflict of interest, she said quietly. I'm here to observe and log, he said. Same as any other spotter. Call your solution. She looked at the target through the scope. 1,200 meters of distance. Elevation change of roughly 40 meters uphill. Primary wind 12 to 16 from northwest. Secondary deflection component adding 3 to 4 effective from the east at approximately 8 degrees upward angle. She dialed her adjustments, took 2 steadying breaths, and called it. Wind call is 9 miles per hour effective right to left at the firing point, transitioning to 6 effective left to right in the mid-range corridor, 3 to 4 secondary component high right from canyon deflection. Elevation adjusted for density altitude and secondary angle. Holding center, slight left edge of the target face. Vasquez made a note without looking up. Send it when ready. She looked at the grass in the mid-range corridor. The indicator flags mounted at 400 and 800 meters, provided as reference, both showed the primary wind vector. They wouldn't show the secondary component because they were positioned below the elevation where the deflection effect was significant. She watched the indicators, watched the grass beyond them, watched the mirage above the target shimmering in its particular way. The primary gust came through and the indicators swung and the grass flattened and the mirage leaned hard left. She waited. 7 seconds. The gust passed. The air went to a brief neutral state, not calm but transitional. The moment between primary and secondary dominance where everything was in motion and nothing was fully committed. She fired. The round went downrange in just over a second of flight time. The steel plate rang with a sound she felt in her back teeth. Hit, Vasquez said. Flat, professional. He was writing something. She ran the bolt, settled again, waited for the next cycle. Her next 4 rounds all hit. Not all center. One caught the upper left quadrant of the plate in a gust that shifted earlier than she'd predicted, and she logged that as a read error she'd need to understand before tomorrow's relay. But all 5 rounds on steel at 1,200 meters in crosswind conditions that had already eliminated one candidate from the course. She stood up, cleared the weapon, and turned to find Vasquez still writing. The upper left on round 4, she said. He looked up. Gust cycled early, she said. I had it at 42 seconds based on morning tracking. It came at 38. I need to recheck whether the cycle shortens as temperature drops. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. It does. The thermal gradient affects gust frequency. Lower temperatures compress the cycle by about 8 to 12%. He paused. That's in the advanced module. Week 7. Good to know, she said, and meant it. She walked back to the observation area. Behind her, she heard him make one more notation in his log, and she didn't look back to see what it was. The second day of the 1,200-meter evaluation was harder. The weather system that had been building over the western mountains arrived overnight and parked itself across the plateau without fully committing to rain. Just a low, dense cloud cover that dropped the light, lowered the temperature another 8 degrees, and added moisture to the air in a way that changed the density-altitude calculation and made everything feel slightly wrong in a way that was difficult to precisely identify. 6 of the remaining candidates dropped below the qualifying threshold across the 2-day evaluation. 3 of them were people Emily would not have predicted. Experienced, technically skilled shooters who had been consistent through the first 5 weeks and came apart in the specific combination of distance, visibility reduction, and the psychological weight of knowing that the final evaluation in 2 weeks was something even harder. That was the thing nobody talked about directly, but everyone was carrying, the 1,600-meter shot at the end. The number sat in the back of every candidate's mind like a door they didn't know if they could open. 1,200 was hard. 1,600 was a different category of problem. At that distance, a 10-mile-per-hour wind shift moved a bullet nearly 18 inches. Bullet flight time approached 2 seconds. The Coriolis effect became a measurable factor, not a theoretical footnote. The shooter was essentially predicting the future and then betting their precision on that prediction. Hatch called the surviving 13 candidates together after the final day of Week 6 evaluation and laid it out without ceremony. 13 of you are still here. The minimum to advance to the final evaluation is a qualifying score on the individual precision assessment in week 7, followed by the capstone shoot in week 8. He looked at the group. The capstone distance has been set at 1,600 meters. Weather dependent. We need a day with readable conditions, not forgiving conditions. There's a difference. He paused. That's the last time I'll mention the distance until we're on the line. You all know what it is. Thinking about it constantly is not useful. Doing the work between now and then is useful. His eyes moved across the group. Dismissed. Nobody moved immediately. The word 1,600 seemed to take up more physical space than the other words. Then Pierce moved, and the group dispersed. Week 7's individual precision assessment ran across 3 days at variable distances between 800 and 1,300 meters, with environmental conditions that changed between relays without notice. A shift in wind direction, a drop in temperature, a scenario where a low cloud system reduced visibility to under a mile, and the candidates had to recalculate for the change in light transmission through the scope. Emily was first on the Day 2 relay, and she heard, from a position near the observation tower, a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. 2 senior officers she didn't recognize. Visiting evaluators, she guessed, from the insignia, though they'd been present since the beginning of week 6 without introduction. They were standing at the edge of the tower platform with spotting scopes, talking in the low voices of people who thought they were out of earshot. Civilian file? Carter, 22, no service history. A pause. She's first on the board. Has been since week 3. Another pause. Longer. Who's watching her? Hatch. Vasquez has been documenting the environmental reads. Apparently, she's been doing things with mirage and wind cycle tracking that they're considering incorporating into the standard curriculum. For the next cycle. That's the discussion. The first voice again. What's her background? Actual background. Ranch family, Montana. Grandfather was LRRP, Vietnam, deceased. Silence. Does she know we're here? No. She kept her face forward and her breathing even. She was 30 meters from the tower base, and the wind was carrying the conversation to her cleanly. She filed it away the way she filed everything, without showing it, without immediately knowing what to do with it, just storing it until the context made it useful. She walked to the firing line when her name was called and shot a qualifying score that Vasquez logged without inflection, the way he logged everything. But she caught him glancing toward the observation tower briefly after her 3rd round, and she understood that whatever the conversation up there had been about, it had not been casual. The incident happened on the afternoon of Day 3. Marsh had been retained in the program despite his Day 1 result at 1,200 meters, having recovered sufficiently in subsequent evaluations to stay above the threshold. He was a good shooter under controlled conditions. The canyon terrain simply exposed something in him. A rigidity in his read process, an over-reliance on the instrument data at the expense of what the environment was actually showing him. He knew it. The tension of knowing it had been sitting on him for a week. During the afternoon relay, he and Emily were positioned adjacent to each other, separated by roughly 4 meters. She was on her 3rd round when she heard his breathing change beside her. A slight quickening, a compression, the sound of someone who was trying to slow down and speeding up in the effort. She kept her focus on her own shot. Sent it, heard the hit. Then she heard Marsh's rifle click on an empty chamber. He'd miscounted his rounds. It was a small error. Procedural. Under competition conditions, it would cost time and composure. Under the program's scoring system, it was logged as a disruption event. What she heard next was him exhale very hard through his nose, a sound that was not quite a word but carried a volume of feeling that didn't need to be. She finished her relay. Stood, cleared her weapon. He was still on the mat, running a reload that his hands were fumbling slightly. She crouched beside him, not close enough to crowd him, just close enough that her voice didn't have to travel. Breathe out first, she said quietly, all the way, then reload. He looked at her. His jaw was tight enough she could see the muscle working. I know how to reload, he said. Yeah. She wasn't going to argue it. Breathe out first anyway. A beat. He exhaled. His hands settled. He finished the reload cleanly. He shot his remaining 2 rounds, both on target. He stood up and they were side by side for a moment, looking downrange. "How do you do it?" he said, not asking how to shoot, asking something underneath that. She thought about it honestly. "I stopped trying to control everything and start trying to understand it," she said. "There's a difference. Control is about force. Understanding is about listening." He was quiet for a moment. "That's either very simple or very hard," he said. "Both," she said. "Depends on the day." She picked up her rifle and walked back to the staging area. The final individual assessment day produced something nobody had planned for. The morning's conditions were close to perfect. Light 2 to 4 miles per hour primary wind, stable temperature, good visibility. The kind of day where the variable had been removed and what remained was purely the shooter's skill against a known problem. Hatch called Emily to the line for the day's final relay at 14:40. The other candidates and all available instructors were present, partly because protocol required observers for the scored relay, and partly because word had moved through the camp that her total score, if she held her current trajectory, would set a new program record for the Week 7 assessment. She didn't know about the record specifically. She knew people were watching. She felt it differently than she'd felt being watched in Week 1. Not as a test of whether she belonged, but as a weight she had to carry through the shot sequence without letting it alter her mechanics. She settled in behind the rifle. The distance was 1,300 meters. The wind was reading 3 miles per hour from the northwest, with almost no secondary canyon effect. A clean, simple day. Clean and simple sometimes made it harder. No complexity to manage meant nothing to put your attention on except the pressure of performance. She found the stillness the way she always found it, not by forcing it, by remembering the stock pond, the grass, her grandfather's stopwatch, and his patience, which had been the most precise instrument he'd ever carried. She breathed. She fired 5 rounds, 5 hits, all center mass. The last 3 were essentially in the same hole on the target face, a grouping so tight that Vasquez walked out to verify it personally before logging the score. He came back, wrote the number, and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Hatch. Hatch was standing behind the observation line with his arms crossed and an expression she'd never seen on him. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. A man encountering something that was making him reclassify a category. He walked to her. She stood with the rifle at low ready, waiting. "That's a program record for the Week 7 individual assessment," he said. "I heard people might be tracking that," she said carefully. "Did you hear from who?" "No." Technically true, she hadn't heard names. He studied her face. She kept it neutral. "The 2 observers from last week," he said. "The ones on the tower. You know who they are?" She waited a beat. "No." "Colonel Margaret Fenn, JSOC Assessment Division, and Brigadier General David Straker, Special Programs Coordination." He paused. "They've been observing this cycle since Week 6, not standard procedure." Another pause. "I thought you should know." The information landed in her quietly and stayed there. JSOC, Special Programs. 2 general officer level observers who had been watching her specifically for 2 weeks. She kept her face still. "What does that mean for the course?" she said. "Nothing for the course. The course runs the same regardless." He looked at her steadily. "It means something for what comes after, if you finish." "When I finish," she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Hatch didn't really do smiles, but the nearest approximation. "When you finish," he said, "get some chow. Week 8 brief is at 0600. He walked away. She stood on the firing line for a moment in the afternoon light. 1,300 meters downrange, the steel target was still swinging very slightly from the impacts, the movement barely visible at this distance, just a glint of metal catching the sun and releasing it and catching it again. Around her, the other candidates were breaking down their positions, moving equipment, talking in the low, purposeful voices of people who had been through something and were ready to be done for the day. Pierce stopped beside her on his way past. "Record," he said. "Hatch told you." "Vasquez told me. He seemed like he wanted to tell someone." Pierce looked at the distant target. "Straker and Fenn, you knew they were watching." It wasn't a question. "I knew someone was," she said. He nodded slowly. JSOC assessment teams don't come to base-level certification courses, not unless they're looking at something specific. He looked at her. You understand what I'm saying? She did. One shot at a time, she said. That's all I'm thinking about. He studied her for a second, then he nodded again. Not agreeing exactly, more like acknowledging a position he respected, even if it wasn't where he would have put his attention. Week 8, he said. Week 8, she said. He moved on. She stayed another moment, watching the target glint in the afternoon sun. 1,600 meters, 2 seconds of bullet flight, a window so narrow it barely existed. She reached into her breast pocket and opened her notebook to the line she'd written in week 5. Don't chase the window, let the window find you. She looked at it for a long time, then she put the notebook away, picked up her rifle, and walked off the line. The week 8 brief started at 0600 exactly, and Hatch was already at the front of the room when the 13 remaining candidates filed in. No preamble, no warm-up. Capstone evaluation is in 4 days, he said. 1,600 meters, 1 shot per candidate. Conditions permitting. We need a window with readable wind, not calm wind. There's a difference, and by now you should understand it. He looked at the room. Scoring is pass-fail. Hit the plate, you complete the program. Miss, you don't. Your cumulative score determines your ranking within those who complete. He paused. Questions. Nobody asked anything. The room had the particular quality of silence that exists when people are processing something too large for immediate words. 4 days, Hatch said again, and that was the brief. Emily spent the first of those 4 days doing what she'd been doing since week 1, walking the terrain. But this time she walked farther, pushing out to the 1,600-meter marker and standing there for a long time looking back toward the firing line. The range looked small from here. The firing point was a thin line of structures and equipment reduced to miniature scale. The observation tower, a narrow vertical shape against the sky. Standing at the target end and looking back at where she'd be shooting from was an inversion she needed. A way of seeing the problem from the other direction, understanding what a bullet was being asked to travel through over that distance. 1,600 meters of Colorado Plateau terrain, elevation change of approximately 65 meters across the range, mostly in the first 800. A crosswind corridor between 400 and 900 meters where the canyon topography narrowed and accelerated whatever was moving through it. A secondary thermal effect in the afternoon where warming rocks on the eastern face created an upward deflection that added a slight but measurable vertical component to anything coming from that direction. She stood at the target and took notes. She wasn't the only one out here. Pierce was 50 meters to her left, doing the same thing, standing at distance and looking back, making his own notations. He glanced at her briefly. She nodded. He went back to his notebook. Reeves came out later that morning and found Emily still at the target end, this time lying flat and looking at the ground-level wind behavior in the grass between her position and the firing line. "You've been out here for 3 hours," Reeves said. "I know." Hatch knows too. He's been watching the field cameras. Reeves crouched beside her. "Is this productive, or is this anxiety dressed up as preparation?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Some of both," she said, which was the honest answer. "That's the most human thing you've said since week 1. Reeves sat down in the dry grass. "What are you actually worried about?" The question sat between them. "That I've been reading this range for 7 weeks, and I still don't know what the wind is going to do on the specific morning we shoot," Emily said. "I can reduce the uncertainty. I can't eliminate it. At 1,600 meters, the part I can't eliminate is big enough to matter. That's true for everyone." "I know." She sat up. "Doesn't make it smaller." Reeves looked at her for a second. "Your grandfather ever miss?" Emily thought about it. "Once," she said. "That I saw. He was shooting a coyote that was after the calves. Long shot, bad light. He missed clean. He didn't say anything for about a minute. Then he adjusted and shot again and didn't miss." She paused. "He told me later that missing wasn't the problem. It was what you did in the next 30 seconds that mattered." Reeves nodded slowly. "What did he do in the next 30 seconds?" "He breathed," Emily said. "That's all. He just breathed." The debrief request came that afternoon. A staff sergeant she didn't recognize appeared at the barracks door and told her that Colonel Fenn was requesting a meeting at 1500 in the administration building. Not Hatch's office, the admin building, which had a separate wing she'd never been in. The sergeant used the word requesting, but his tone said something different. She went at 1500. The room they put her in had real furniture, not the folding tables and cinder block walls of the program spaces, but actual chairs, a wooden desk, a window that looked out over the western end of the range. Colonel Margaret Fenn was seated behind the desk when Emily entered, mid-50s, hair going silver at the temples. The kind of posture that wasn't performed. It was just how she held herself, like it had long ago stopped being a choice. A man Emily didn't know sat in a chair to the right. Civilian clothes, no insignia, the particular quality of stillness that suggested either boredom or very disciplined attention. She couldn't tell which. "Sit down, Ms. Carter," Fenn said. Emily sat. Fenn looked at her for a moment without speaking. It was the kind of look that was doing work, measuring something, filing it. "I'll be direct," Fenn said. "We've been observing this cycle specifically because of your application. We flagged it in June when it came through the civilian exception pathway, and your intake documentation included your grandfather's service record." "His service record," Emily said carefully. "Thomas Roy Carter. 2 tours, Vietnam, LRRP, 101st Airborne. Subsequent to his separation, he was involved in 2 private sector training consultations between 1991 and 1998 for programs I can't name in this room." Fenn held her gaze. He was not simply a rancher who happened to have served. He was one of the most sophisticated field instructors of his generation who chose to spend the last 20 years of his life in a very quiet place. The information didn't knock her over. It landed in the center of something she'd suspected for a long time and never had language for. The way her grandfather knew things that no amount of deer hunting explained. The way he'd trained her in patterns that she'd later recognized as deliberate skill architecture rather than casual outdoor education. She kept her face still. "He never told me about the consulting work," she said. "We wouldn't expect him to." Fenn paused. "What he taught you, he taught you. The method and the intention were his. What we're interested in is the result." The civilian in the chair to the right spoke for the first time. "Your week 7 score," he said. His voice was flat, accent neutral in the way that suggested it had been worked on. It set a program record. "Do you know what the previous record was?" "No." "Held by a SEAL warrant officer who went through this cycle 6 years ago. He went on to serve as a primary long-range asset on 3 JSOC operations over the following 4 years. His record stood until 4 days ago." A pause. "You are 22 years old with no service history, and you beat it by 11 points. She didn't say anything. "We want to understand what we're looking at," Fenn said. "Not for this program's purposes. The program is going to certify you regardless of this conversation. This is about what comes after." "What comes after?" Emily said. "That depends partly on you." Fenn folded her hands on the desk. "And partly on what happens in 4 days." The meeting ended 20 minutes later without Emily agreeing to anything, because nothing specific had been put on the table to agree to. She walked back across the compound in the afternoon wind with the information sitting in her and tried to decide how much of it to let herself think about before the capstone shot. She decided, none of it. Not until after. Her grandfather had told her once that the most dangerous thing a hunter could carry into the field was the weight of what they wanted the outcome to be. The mountain didn't accommodate wanting. It only responded to paying attention. She went to clean her rifle. Pierce found her that evening, not on the bench outside this time. She was in the equipment room, running a final check on her optics, adjusting the scope 0 for the expected morning temperature. He came in without knocking, which was normal for the equipment room, and started pulling his own kit without speaking. They worked in silence for a while. "Fenn called you in," he said eventually. "Not a question." "This afternoon?" "She called me in too, yesterday morning." He was working a cleaning patch through his bore with the methodical rhythm of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Asked about the team assessment, the 8-second moment." She looked up from the scope adjustment. "What did you tell her?" "The truth?" He kept his eyes on the bore. That she read the wind cycle, and I made the decision to trust it, and it was the right call. A pause. I told her it was a decision I should have made faster, that I cost us 4 seconds of hesitation that we wouldn't have had if I'd been ahead of the information instead of chasing it. She looked at him. "That's honest," she said. "Yeah, well." He set down the cleaning rod. She asked me what I thought your ceiling was. Capability ceiling. The room was quiet except for the wind outside pushing against the metal siding of the building. "What did you say?" she said. He looked at her directly. I told her I didn't know, and that was the first time in my career I've said that about another shooter and meant it as a compliment. He picked up the bore brush. I also told her the documentation complaint I filed in week 1 was based on bad assumptions and I wanted it noted. She held his gaze. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yeah, I did." He went back to work. It was wrong. Wrong things should be corrected in the record. She looked back at the scope, made one final click of adjustment. "Pierce," she said. "Yeah. You're going to make the shot." He was quiet for a second. "So are you," he said. Not. The morning of the capstone evaluation arrived with the conditions Hatch had been waiting for. Not calm. Calm wasn't what he'd asked for. What arrived was a steady 8 to 10 mile per hour wind from the northwest with minimal gusting, a clear sky, stable temperature in the low 40s, and the kind of atmospheric clarity that made the distant target visible through a spotting scope with unusual sharpness. The secondary canyon deflection was present but predictable. The steady primary wind suppressed the chaotic component and made the deflection track consistently rather than variably. Readable. Not easy. Readable. Hatch stood in front of the 13 candidates at the firing line at 0800 and looked at them for a long moment. "One shot," he said. "Take your time. Don't take too much time. You've had 8 weeks to prepare. Either you're ready or you're not, and standing at the line for 20 minutes won't change which one it is." He stepped back. First relay, Ferreira, Donnelly, Pierce. Firing positions. Emily was in the second relay. She moved to the observation area and brought her spotting scope up. The target at 1,600 meters was a steel silhouette, humanoid-shaped, roughly half-scale, painted flat gray, so it didn't reflect strongly in the morning light. It was suspended on a frame designed to show both the impact mark and a slight movement on hit, giving spotters a confirmation signal independent of the audio. Ferreira went first. He was the competition shooter, 6 years of long-range matches, the most technically prepared candidate in the program. He settled in, took 4 minutes that felt like longer, and fired. She watched through the scope. The target moved. Hit. Ferreira stood up, and the body language said everything. Relief first, then the carefully controlled expression of someone who didn't want to show too much. Donnelly was next. The Marine Master Sergeant. He fired inside 2 minutes, which was fast, and she watched the target and it didn't move, and then it moved. She wasn't sure. The movement was slight, on the edge of what the scope showed her. "Hit," the range safety officer called. "High right quadrant." On the target face, a hit. Pierce was last in the first relay. He took 6 minutes to settle, which was longer than she'd expected from him, and she understood it. The distance was beyond anything he'd done in a competitive context, and the patience required to trust his read and not force the shot was fighting against his natural operational tempo. He fired. The target swung clearly, center mass. She exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. The second relay. Her name was first. She carried her rifle to the firing position and set up with movement so habitual by now they required no conscious direction. Bipod deployment, cheek weld, scope picture, natural point of aim check, breathing assessment. The target at 1,600 meters was a small gray shape in the optic, exactly as she'd seen it through her spotting scope during the 4 days of preparation. Her spotter was Vasquez. "Ready when you are," he said. She looked at the target, at the mid-range wind indicators, at the grass in the corridor between 400 and 900 meters, at the heat shimmer beginning to build above the range floor as the sun climbed. 8 to 10 miles per hour, consistent. Canyon deflection tracking predictably. Temperature stable. Density altitude calculated. She dialed her firing solution. 6 minutes of angle elevation, 2.4 right for wind. a half-click correction for the canyon deflection component. The numbers were ones she'd run 40 times in the previous 4 days under every anticipated condition. She settled into the stock, found her position, breathed. At 1,600 meters, there was no room for anything except the next 2 seconds of the world. She stopped thinking about Fenn, about the civilian in the chair, about the record, about Pierce, about her grandfather's old stopwatch, about the 8 weeks behind her, and whatever was ahead. She watched the grass in the mid-range corridor. Steady, 8 miles per hour. Consistent lean, northwest. She watched the heat shimmer above the target, boiling slow and leaning slightly, reading the same as the corridor wind. She put the reticle at the point her solution indicated, slightly above and left of center on the target face, letting the ballistics carry the round to the impact point. Her heart rate was slow. She could feel it in her throat, unhurried. She breathed out halfway. The world narrowed to the reticle and the target and the steadiness of the air in between. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. 1 second passed. She held position, watching through the scope, not tracking the shot. You couldn't track a bullet at this distance. There was nothing to track. Just watching the target face and counting internally the way she'd been trained not to do and did anyway because it was the only way to manage the 2 seconds of not knowing. 1.8. The target swung. Hard. Decisively. The movement of a solid center hit, not the subtle tremor of an edge impact. Hit, Vasquez said. His voice was completely level, but she heard something underneath the levelness, a controlled quality, like a door held mostly shut. Correction, he said, and she looked at him. He was looking through the spotting scope with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Hit, center mass, he said. Confirmed. She released the remaining air from her lungs. She ran the bolt, set the rifle on safe, stood up. Hatch was behind the firing line. Fenn was there too, standing 20 meters back, arms at her sides, watching. The civilian whose name she still didn't know was beside her. Around the range, candidates and instructors had gone completely quiet, not the polite silence of people watching an evaluation. Something different. The kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people has simultaneously recognized that they've witnessed something they're going to remember. Hatch walked to her, stopped 2 feet away. Center mass at 1,600 meters, he said. Confirmed. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a second. Your grandfather teach you to do that, he said. She thought about it honestly. He taught me to pay attention, she said. The rest was the work. Hatch nodded once, slowly. Then he extended his hand and she shook it, and that was all. No speech, no ceremony, just a handshake from a man who didn't give them easily and meant something by it every single time. The remaining candidates shot through the morning. Of the 13, 9 made the hit. 3 missed. 1 by margin, 2 by distance. That suggested a fundamental calculation error rather than an execution problem. Marsh, who had been the question mark since his day 1 failure at 1,200 meters, shot last and stood at the line for 8 minutes before firing and hit the target in the lower left quadrant, which was a hit, which was enough. And he sat down in the dirt behind the firing line and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds and then stood up and was fine. She understood that. By 1400, the evaluations were complete. 9 candidates had completed the program. 4 had not. The 4 departures were handled with the same quiet dignity as every departure before them. No announcement, no ceremony, just acknowledgement and handshakes, and the understanding that what they'd accomplished in 8 weeks was significant regardless of the final shot. Emily sat on the tailgate of a range vehicle in the afternoon sun, still in her shooting gear, watching the range crew begin breaking down the 1,600-meter target frame. Pierce came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and for a while neither of them said anything. 9 out of 13, he said eventually. Better than I expected, she said. Me too. He was quiet for a moment. Fenn's going to want to talk to you again. I know. She's going to put something on the table. I know. And you're going to have to decide what you want. He looked at her. Not what she wants, not what your grandfather would have wanted. What you want. She looked out at the range. The target frame was coming down, two crew members working the bolts, the steel silhouette tilting slowly toward the ground. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the truth. "That's a legitimate answer," he said. The frame came down. The crew lifted the target and carried it toward the equipment trailer. The range floor stretched empty and flat in the afternoon light, and without the target to anchor it, the distance looked different. Not smaller, not larger, just honest. Just the actual space between 2 points, which was all it had ever been. 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks, he agreed. She thought about the parking lot on the first morning, the tourist directions voice, the bench outside the barracks where he'd sat at the far end and worked his way towards something he couldn't quite name yet. 8 seconds in the brush with the wind cycling through the grass. "Pierce," she said. "Yeah. You're a good shooter." He was quiet for a second. "So are you," he said. "Best I've ever seen." It was the most direct thing he'd ever said to her without any qualification built into it, and she recognized the cost of that kind of directness for someone built the way he was built, and she let it mean what it meant. "Thanks," she said. They sat on the tailgate until the range crew finished and the afternoon light went gold across the canyon walls, and the wind kept doing what it always did, moving through everything, measuring everything, patient and indifferent, and not caring in the slightest what anyone had proven today. It had been here before any of them. It would be here long after. She thought that was the right way to understand it. Fen came to find her before dinner. Not a summons this time. No staff sergeant at the barracks door. No formal request. The colonel simply appeared at the edge of the equipment cleaning area where Emily was breaking down her rifle for what she suspected would be the last time at Red Canyon, and stood there until Emily looked up and then sat down on the bench across from her without ceremony. The civilian from the administration building meeting was not present. That told Emily something about the nature of this conversation before a word was spoken. "Good shot today," Fen said. "Thank you, ma'am." "I don't say that as a compliment. I say it as a data point. The compliment is implicit." Fen looked at the disassembled rifle on the mat. "You clean your own weapon?" "Yes." "Always?" "My grandfather said if you can't maintain it, you don't deserve to shoot it." Emily ran a patch through the bore. "I've never found a reason to disagree." Fen was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "I want to put something on the table," Fen said. "Directly, because I think you respond better to direct." "Yes, ma'am." There are currently 3 programs running under Special Operations Coordination that are looking at precision capability development in ways that go beyond conventional sniper certification. Not field deployment units, assessment and development programs. They build training methodology. They identify capability gaps and design solutions. She paused. "What you demonstrated over 8 weeks, specifically the environmental reading, the mirage wind technique, the gust cycle tracking, those are methods that exist in institutional knowledge, but have never been successfully formalized into teachable curriculum. Your grandfather knew how to do what you do. He chose not to write it down. We'd like to change that." Emily set down the bore brush. "You want me to help develop training curriculum," she said. "Among other things." Fen's eyes were level. "The position would carry a contractor designation initially, transitioning to a program specialist role within 18 months if the fit is right. It's not a combat role. It's not what Pierce does. It's something different, and in my assessment, something more valuable in the long run." Emily looked at the disassembled rifle in front of her. The barrel, the action, the stock, everything reduced to its components, each one honest about what it was and what it did. "Can I think about it?" she said. "I'd be concerned if you didn't." Fen stood. "Graduation ceremony is at 0900 tomorrow. We'll talk after." She moved to leave, then stopped. "Carter?" "Ma'am?" "Your grandfather's consulting files, the 1991 to 1998 work I mentioned." A pause. "Most of it is still classified, but there's a summary document that was declassified 3 years ago. I can have a copy on Hatch's desk for you tomorrow morning if you want it." Emily looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I want it." Fen nodded once and walked away, and Emily sat alone in the equipment area with the pieces of her rifle and the low sound of wind moving through the canyon in the last of the evening light. She thought about her grandfather, about the specific quality of his silences. Not empty silences, loaded ones, full of things he'd decided not to say for reasons she'd never pushed him on. She had respected the boundary because she loved him, and because the parts of himself he shared were so fully present that she hadn't felt the absence of the parts he kept. Now she understood the shape of what he'd been carrying. She picked up the barrel and resumed cleaning it. The steel was cold in her hands, and the solvent smell was sharp in the evening air, and somewhere across the compound someone was laughing at something. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that comes at the end of something hard when the relief finally arrives. She listened to it and worked and didn't stop until the rifle was clean. Mashik. The summary document was 9 pages, partially redacted, typed on paper that had the slightly waxy texture of old photocopies. Hatch left it in a plain envelope on his desk with her name written on the outside in his particular blocky handwriting, and she sat in the empty briefing room at 700 with a cup of bad coffee and read it twice. Thomas Roy Carter. The document didn't tell her what she already knew: the Vietnam service, the ranch, the 30 years of quiet in the mountains. What it told her was the 9 years between: 2 training consultation contracts, one with a federal law enforcement agency and one with a joint military intelligence working group that was identified only by a series of letters she didn't recognize. The subject matter of the consultations was described in language so compressed and bureaucratic it almost lost its meaning. Advanced fieldcraft transmission methodologies, environmental reading protocols, non-instrumented precision estimation techniques. He had spent 9 years teaching people what he later spent 10 years teaching her. Not the same people. Not the same context, but the same core knowledge: how to read the world honestly, how to move through it patiently, how to make precise decisions in the space between what you could measure and what you had to feel. He had then walked away from it, retired to Montana for real this time, bought more cattle, fixed fence lines, and spent the last decade of his life teaching a child on a ranch instead of operators in a facility. She sat with that for a while. She understood, she thought, why he'd made the choice. Not because she agreed with it entirely, but because she recognized the logic in it. The decision that the most important transmission of knowledge was the direct one, the personal one, the kind that happened over years rather than weeks, and that went all the way down instead of spreading wide. He had taught her the way he'd taught her because he'd already taught the other way, and he'd chosen something different. She folded the document and put it in her breast pocket next to the notebook. Then she went to get cleaned up for the graduation. The ceremony was held on the central parade ground at 900 under a sky that had cleared overnight to something close to perfect. The particular deep blue of high altitude in autumn, the kind that looked painted. 9 candidates in clean uniforms, or the civilian equivalents, standing in a formation that was smaller and quieter than the one 8 weeks ago and had a different weight to it. Hatch read their names in alphabetical order. Each one walked forward, received a certificate and a handshake, and returned to position. When he read her name, she walked to the front and he handed her the certificate, and she looked at it briefly. Her name, the program name, the date, a certification number. And then she shook his hand and he held the shake a half-second longer than the others. "Montana," he said quietly, for just her. "Montana," she agreed. She returned to her position in the formation. After the reading of names, Hatch addressed them briefly. Less a speech than a set of observations delivered in his particular compressed style, each sentence doing the work of a paragraph. "What you learned here isn't complete," he said. "It's a foundation. The work continues after today, regardless of where you go next. The range is the controlled version. Everything past this gate is the real version." He looked down the line. "You represented yourselves well. You represented this program well. Dismissed." The formation broke. Around her, the 9 candidates moved toward each other in the natural way of people who have been through something together. Not backslapping celebration, more like a collective exhale, small groups forming and talking quietly. Reeves found her first and simply grabbed her forearm for a second without speaking, which communicated everything. Castillo and Webb, the Rangers who had lost Garrett weeks back and carried that quietly ever since, stood nearby and nodded at her in the specific way that military people sometimes nod, which means several things at once and none of them need to be said. Marsh was talking to Vasquez near the edge of the parade ground, and she caught the end of what he was saying to the instructor. Something about the mirage technique, about wanting to continue working on it. Vasquez was listening with his characteristic focused expression, and Emily thought that this was probably how things actually changed, not through announcements, but through individual people deciding to keep learning after the course was over. Then Pierce was beside her. He was in his Class A uniform, the first time she'd seen him in anything other than field gear in 8 weeks, and the ribbons above his left breast pocket were enough to make the point without anyone having to say anything about them. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the formal uniform, the way people do when they're more at home in the field version. "Ceremony suits you," she said. "It does not," he said. "I look like a museum exhibit." He looked out at the parade ground. "You talked to Fenn last night." "And?" She was quiet for a moment. "She made an offer," Emily said. "Curriculum development. Formalizing the environmental reading methodology into teachable material." "That's not what I expected her to offer." "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Field-adjacent assessment role, something that would put your capability to immediate operational use." He paused. "The curriculum offer is longer view." "Yeah." "Which means she thinks the methodology is more valuable than any single deployment of it." "That's how I read it." He looked at her. "What do you think?" She watched a hawk move in a slow circle above the eastern canyon wall, the same wall that created the deflection effect she'd spent 5 weeks mapping. From up there, the deflection wouldn't exist, just clean air moving without obstruction. "I think my grandfather spent 9 years in programs like what she's describing," Emily said, "and then spent 20 more years teaching one person everything he'd learned, and I think both choices were right for their time, and neither was the whole answer." Pierce was quiet for a moment. "What's the whole answer?" he said. "Both," she said. "You formalize what can be formalized. You also make sure there's a version of it that's personal enough to actually go all the way down into someone." That's not what she offered. "Not yet." She looked at him. "I'm going to talk to her after. Tell her I'll take the curriculum role with one condition." "Which is?" "That I get to design the transmission methodology from the ground up, not adapt existing frameworks, build a new one." She paused. "The way he built it, direct, personal, long." Pierce looked at her for a long second. "She might say no," he said. "She might." Emily shrugged. "Then I'll know the offer wasn't actually what she said it was." He almost smiled, the nearest version of it she'd seen from him, just a slight movement at the corner of his mouth that came and went quickly. "You're going to be very difficult to work with," he said. "Probably," she said. "Are you going to be working with me?" He looked across the parade ground, then back at her. "Fenn asked me to stay on for a liaison role with the new methodology program. If it gets approved." He said it carefully, like he was still deciding what he thought about it. "I told her I'd consider it." "What are you considering?" "Whether I'm more useful in the field or in a building where I'm trying to teach people what I know." He paused. "I'm good at the field. I don't know if I'm good at the other thing." "You were good at the 8-second moment," she said. He looked at her. "That was you," he said. "That was you trusting information from a source you'd already decided you didn't trust," she said. "That's actually harder than the field. In the field, you trust your training. In a room with someone who knows something different than you have to decide to update. Most people don't." She held his gaze. "You did. That's teachable, if you're willing to teach it." The hawk above the eastern wall caught a thermal and rose without effort, circling higher, and then banked north and disappeared over the rim. Pierce watched it go. "Montana," he said, the way Hatch had said it, quiet and slightly wondering. "Montana," she said. The meeting with Fenn happened at 1100 in the administration building, back in the room with real furniture and the window overlooking the western range. The civilian was there again this time, and a third person Emily hadn't seen before. A man in his 40s, lean, with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent a long time in environments where rushing was a liability. He was introduced as Marcus Webb, No relation to the ranger, program director for the methodology initiative Fenn had described. Fenn laid out the offer formally this time. Contract terms, timeline, deliverables, the language of institutions. Emily listened to all of it. Then she put her condition on the table. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. You want to design the transmission framework, Webb said. Not hostile, genuinely processing. The formalization piece is fine, Emily said. You want the mirage reading and the gust cycle tracking and the environmental integration documented in curriculum form. I can do that. But the way those skills actually transfer to a person isn't through a classroom module. The reason I can do what I do is because it was transmitted to me over 10 years in conditions that were personal enough that it went somewhere deeper than technique. She kept her voice level. If you want material that can be taught in a 2-week module and checked off a list, I'm not the right person for it. But if you want to build something that actually produces people who can do what I did on that range today, the transmission methodology has to be different. Different how? The civilian said. Longer, more direct, smaller cohorts, environmental immersion instead of classroom introduction. She paused. Essentially, you'd be building a program inside this program, an apprenticeship track alongside the standard certification course. Fenn looked at Webb. Webb was looking at Emily with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not resistance, not enthusiasm, something more careful than either. That's a significant resource commitment for an unproven model, he said. The model isn't unproven, she said. You've got one data point sitting in this room. A silence. Webb looked at the table. Then he picked up a pen and wrote something in his notepad that she couldn't read from where she was sitting. One cohort, Fenn said. We run the standard curriculum in parallel with a pilot apprenticeship track. Maximum 6 candidates in the pilot, 12 months. At the end of 12 months, we evaluate the outcome. She looked at Emily steadily. If the results support the model, it continues and expands. If they don't, the contract ends and you go home to Montana. And I have full design authority over the pilot track curriculum, Emily said. With oversight from Marcus's office, Fenn said. Not direction, oversight. Emily looked at Webb. He met her gaze. I can work with oversight, she said. Then we have an agreement in principle, Fenn said. Legal will have paperwork ready before you leave today. Emily nodded. Then she looked at Fenn directly. The document you gave me this morning, she said. My grandfather's consulting work. Fenn's expression didn't change. What about it? Fenn said. He walked away from it, Emily said. In 1998, he walked away from programs exactly like what you're describing and went to a ranch and spent the rest of his life in a different kind of transmission entirely. She kept her eyes on Fenn. I want to understand why, before I commit to doing something similar. A pause. He walked away because he was asked to compromise the integrity of what he taught, Fenn said carefully. The 1997 contract included a directive to accelerate the curriculum timeline in ways he believed degraded the output. He refused. The contract was terminated. Another pause. He was right, in my assessment. The program that replaced his methodology produced inferior results for 11 years until it was quietly discontinued. The room was very still. That's why you're offering me design authority, Emily said. That's part of why, Fenn said. Emily sat with that. Her grandfather had been right, had known he was right, had refused to compromise it, and had walked away rather than let the institutional logic override the thing he'd learned at a cost she'd only begun to understand. And she was sitting in the same room, being offered the same terms with the same risk underneath them. One more condition, she said. Fenn waited. If I'm asked to compromise the methodology, to accelerate beyond what the evidence supports, to reduce cohort time for administrative convenience, to check boxes instead of build capability, the contract terminates at my discretion, not yours. No penalty clause, no waiting period. The civilian started to say something. Fenn held up a hand. Agreed, Fenn said. Webb looked at Fenn. Then he looked at Emily and something moved in his expression. Something that might have been respect, or might have been the recalibration of a person who had expected a different kind of negotiation and was adjusting his model. Agreed, he said. Emily exhaled. Then let's get the paperwork, she said. Yeast, She called Reeves that evening from the payphone near the main gate. Her cell coverage had been non-existent for 8 weeks, and she'd barely noticed, and told her the outline of it, the curriculum role, the apprenticeship pilot, the terms. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "So you're staying," she said. "For now." "That's a significant for now." "I know." Emily looked out at the canyon in the evening light. "It feels right. Not completely comfortable. I don't think it's supposed to be completely comfortable yet, but right." "Your grandfather would have an opinion about it," Reeves said. "He would." Emily thought about the 9 pages of summary document in her pocket. "I think he'd say I was making the same mistake he made and then tell me I had to make it anyway so I could understand what he understood. That's a very grandfather thing to say. He was a very grandfather kind of person." She paused. "You going back to the unit?" "Next week. Leave first, then back." Reeves paused. "Carter, for what it's worth, watching you these 8 weeks did something to how I think about what I'm capable of. Not in a competitive way, in a recalibration way." Emily was quiet. "That means something," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "Keep in touch." "Yeah," Emily said. She hung up the phone. The evening was cooling fast the way it always did at elevation, and the canyon walls had gone from orange to rust to the deep gray that preceded dark. The first stars were coming in at the eastern edge of the sky. She stayed at the payphone for a little while, not calling anyone else, just standing in the cooling air and looking at the range through the fence line. The target stands were bare. The 1,600-meter frame hadn't been rebuilt after the crew took it down. The range floor was empty and flat, and the distance was simply distance again, neutral, uncommitted. She thought about what it had taken to cross it. Not just today. All of it. The 8 weeks, the years before. The decade of mornings in Montana grass, learning to be still, learning to be patient, learning that the world gave up its information to people who were willing to wait for it. Her grandfather had known the cost of that education and had given it to her anyway. Had chosen to give it in the most direct form he knew, person to person, morning by morning, the kind of transmission that went all the way down to somewhere that couldn't be taken back. She was going to try to do the same thing for a small cohort of people who would take it further than she could imagine, and some of them would do it imperfectly, and some of them would fail entirely, and a few of them would carry it somewhere that justified the whole effort. That was how knowledge survived, not in documents, not in records, in people who made the choice to pass it forward. Pierce found her on the fence line. He was out of uniform now. Civilian clothes, a jacket against the evening cold, a cup of coffee in each hand. He held one out and she took it without asking if it was any good, because it was Red Canyon coffee and was therefore definitively bad, which she had made her peace with 6 weeks ago. "You took the offer," he said. It wasn't a question. He could read her. "Modified," she said. "Design authority. Exit clause." "Smart. Necessary." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "You?" "Liaison role," he said. "1 year. See how it runs." He looked out at the range. "First time in 15 years I won't have a deployment rotation." "How does that feel?" He considered it honestly, which she'd learned was the way he did most things once he'd decided to engage with them. "Strange," he said. "Not bad strange, just different than the shape I'm used to." "That's how it should feel," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Did your grandfather tell you that?" "No," she said. "That one's mine." He almost smiled again. The same almost as before, that brief, controlled shift at the corner of his mouth that came and went quickly. She was starting to understand it was the real version, not a suppressed one. Some people's joy was loud. His was small and fast and genuine exactly because it didn't perform. They stood at the fence line and drank the bad coffee while the dark came fully in and the stars increased, and the canyon settled into its nighttime quality. Deeper, quieter, the kind of silence that had its own texture. "I owe you an apology," Pierce said. "Not for the documentation complaint. I addressed that in the record. For the parking lot on day 1. For the first 2 weeks." "You don't," she said. "I do." He kept his eyes on the range. I dismissed you based on what you looked like, not on any evidence. That's not how I want to operate. It's not how I was trained to operate. I knew better, and I didn't do better, and that's worth saying out loud." She looked at him. "You recalibrated," she said, "faster than most people would have." Still took too long. "Yeah," she said, "it did." She let that sit between them without softening it, because he hadn't asked her to soften it, and he wouldn't respect her for doing it anyway. He nodded once, accepting the weight of it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They finished the coffee. The canyon was fully dark now except for the compound lights behind them and the stars above, which at this elevation and this distance from any city were more numerous and more honest-looking than she'd seen since Montana. She thought about driving back into the canyon that first morning in the transport van, watching the plateau emerge through the windshield like something rising from the earth. She thought about the 7 other candidates in that van who had not spoken to her for 30 minutes because there was nothing in their model for what she was. She thought about Hatch's expression on the day she rose from the brush 93 yards from the instructor station, the specific quality of stillness in him before he said, "Go get chow." She thought about Vasquez redesigning the Mirage module, about Marsh breathing out before the reload, about Reeves sitting in dry grass asking if this was preparation or anxiety dressed up as preparation, about the way Webb had looked at her in the administration building, recalibrating, updating the model. She thought about 8 seconds in a patch of scrub brush with the wind cycling through the grass and Pierce deciding to trust a read from a source he'd almost written off. All of it had happened the way things happen when they're real, imperfectly, out of sequence, with friction and error, and the occasional moment of grace that was only recognizable afterward. Her grandfather had told her once that you never knew what you taught someone until years later, when you saw them do something in a moment of pressure that they hadn't known they knew. He'd said he hoped she'd forgive him for the things he'd gotten wrong in the teaching. She'd told him he hadn't gotten anything wrong. He'd said, "That's how you know you got it." She understood now what he meant. The things you got right became invisible, just the way things were. The things you got wrong were the visible part, the texture, the friction that made the transmission real. She had 8 weeks of that kind of friction behind her and an unknown amount ahead. She was going to build something with it. Graduation night had no formal event. People drifted toward the mess hall in the common area in the easy, unscheduled way of people whose structure had just been removed, and the conversations ran longer than usual and covered more ground than the tactical and procedural talk of the previous 8 weeks. Vasquez sat with Emily for an hour after dinner, and they talked through the apprenticeship pilot framework, what it would need, what it couldn't be, where the institutional resistance would come from, and how to address it before it became obstruction. He asked questions that told her he'd been thinking about the methodology problem longer than she'd known, and she asked questions that told him she wasn't going to run this alone, which seemed to be what he needed to hear. "The Mirage module," he said, "the way I redesigned it for this cycle. That was a start, but the classroom version is still incomplete. Because you can't teach it in a classroom," she said. "I know." He looked at his coffee. "You can introduce it. You can't transmit it." "That's exactly the word," she said. He looked up. "Transmission," she said. "That's what we're designing, not teaching. Transmission, the difference matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be part of the pilot," he said. "As an instructor, if you'll have me." She looked at him. "You understand it means doing it my way on the methodology design," she said. "Not yours, not the program standard. Mine." "I've been watching you for 8 weeks," he said. "I think your way is worth the experiment." "It's not an experiment," she said. "I know it works. We're just proving it to people who need the proof." He almost smiled. "Then yes," he said. "I'm in." She left Red Canyon the following morning at 600 in the same government transport van, but going the opposite direction, the plateau falling away behind her as the road descended toward the highway. She had a manila envelope on her lap with the contract paperwork. She had her rifle case in the rear cargo area, which she'd been authorized to take as part of the certification package. She had the 9-page summary document in her breast pocket next to the notebook. She had a 12-month commitment to a building she was going to help design from the inside, with people she was just beginning to know, building something that didn't fully exist yet and might fail and might not, and either way would tell her something she needed to know. The highway opened up ahead of the van, and the Colorado landscape flattened into the long horizontal distances of the high plains, the kind of country that looked empty to people who didn't know how to look at it. She knew how to look at it. She looked at the grass moving in the morning wind and read the direction and velocity without deciding to, the way you breathe without deciding to, the way certain things become so deeply part of you that they stop being something you do and start being something you are. Her grandfather had known she would end up somewhere like this. She was almost certain of it now. He'd built toward it for 10 years without naming it, the way you build toward a target you're not supposed to think about, just doing the work, trusting that if the foundation is right, the structure will follow. She looked at the grass one more time. 8 miles per hour. West-northwest. Steady. She noted it. She looked at the road ahead. And if you're out there right now, feeling unseen, feeling underestimated, feeling like the room has already decided what you are before you've had the chance to show them, remember this: the mountain doesn't care what they decided. It only asks whether you've been paying attention. Keep paying attention. That is the whole work. The rest follows. The van had been on the highway for 20 minutes when Emily opened her notebook to a blank page. She didn't write anything immediately, just held the pen and looked at the page and let the road move under her. Then she wrote 3 words at the top. What I learned. Not for the curriculum, not for Fenn or Webb or anyone in a building with a whiteboard. For herself. The way her grandfather had kept a small leather journal that she'd found in his desk drawer after he died, filled with observations in his cramped handwriting. Not about shooting, not about the ranch, just about what he'd noticed. What the world had shown him on specific mornings, what he'd gotten wrong, and what the correction had cost him, and what it had given him in return. She owed herself the same accounting. Well, the first thing she wrote was this: being underestimated is not the same as being unseen. She had spent the first 2 weeks at Red Canyon feeling like a ghost in the room, present but unacknowledged, existing in the margins of other people's assumptions. She had interpreted that as invisibility. But invisibility and underestimation were different problems with different solutions. Invisibility meant you weren't there. Underestimation meant you were there, and they'd looked and drawn the wrong conclusion. The difference mattered because underestimation contained a seed of eventual correction. If you stayed in the room long enough, did the work consistently enough, the correction would come. It might come slowly. It might come at a cost. But it would come, because evidence is patient and assumptions are not. She had not changed anyone's mind by arguing. She had changed it by pulling the trigger. The second thing she wrote was, patience is not passive. It is the most aggressive thing I know. People misunderstood patience. They thought it meant waiting for something to happen. What it actually meant was staying present and prepared while nothing was happening yet, maintaining the internal conditions necessary for the right response when the moment arrived. Her grandfather had been the most patient person she'd ever known, and also, when the moment came, the most precise. Those two things were not in tension. They were the same thing. The waiting was the preparation. The stillness was the work. The people who thought patience was the absence of action had never held a breath for 3 seconds at 1,600 meters and felt the whole world narrow to a single point of absolute intention. The third thing she wrote was harder. I was wrong about not needing anyone. She had come into the program believing she could do it alone, not out of arrogance, but out of habit. Montana had taught her self-sufficiency. Her grandfather had been her entire world for a decade. When he died, she had folded inward and stayed there and told herself it was strength. It wasn't only strength, some of it was grief that hadn't finished moving through her yet. What 8 weeks at Red Canyon had shown her was that Pierce trusting her read in the brush mattered. Not because she needed the validation, she'd already known the wind cycle was right, but because there was something different about being trusted by someone who had started from the position of not trusting you at all. It required both of them, the trust and the person willing to be trusted. Reeves, sitting in dry grass asking honest questions. Webb watching and updating his assessment. Vasquez redesigning a module because the evidence pointed somewhere his curriculum hadn't gone yet. Marsh breathing out before the reload. She had not done any of those things. They had happened around her, adjacent to her, because of the work she'd done, but not exclusively by her. A team of people she hadn't expected to find had built something alongside her without announcing that's what they were doing. She wrote, "The people who change alongside you are the ones worth carrying forward." The fourth thing came more slowly. She looked out the window at the high plains moving past, flat and brown and honest in the morning light, and she thought about the summary document in her pocket. 9 pages about a man she thought she'd known completely. She wrote, "What people don't tell you about themselves is sometimes the most important thing they ever teach you." Her grandfather had not told her about the consulting years. He had not explained the architecture of what he was transmitting or why he was transmitting it that particular way. He had just taken her out every morning and let her figure out what she was doing wrong and stayed quiet while she did it. She understood now that the silence was deliberate, not withholding, protecting. If he had explained the methodology, she would have learned the methodology. By not explaining it, he made her learn something deeper than that. The instinct underneath the method, the part that couldn't be abbreviated or summarized or put into a module. He had given her the hardest version because he knew it was the only version that would hold. She was going to spend the next year trying to do the same for 6 people she hadn't met yet. She would get some of it wrong. She was certain of that. The part she got wrong would show her something the part she got right couldn't. That was the deal, and she was taking it with both eyes open. The fifth thing she wrote, last, was the simplest. The shot is not the point. Everything that made the shot possible is the point. People would remember the 1,600-meter hit. That was the story. The distance, the conditions, the civilian girl nobody had believed. It was a good story, and it was true. And it was also, in the way that visible things often are, only the surface of something that went much deeper. The shot took 2 seconds. The preparation took 22 years. Every morning in the grass, every hour behind the scope. Every wrong read and corrected hold and burned shot that taught her something a perfect shot couldn't. Every silence from her grandfather that made her work harder to understand something instead of waiting to be told. The shot was the proof. The life before it was the substance. She looked at the 5 things she'd written and closed the notebook. Outside, the plains stretched in every direction under a sky that was just beginning to show the blue it would carry all day. The deep, clear, high-altitude blue she associated now with Colorado, with the canyon, with 8 weeks of becoming something she'd always been, but had only just fully arrived at. To everyone who traveled this story all the way to the end, thank you. Thank you for your time, which is the only thing none of us can get back. You could have spent these hours anywhere. You spent them here, with Emily and the canyon and the wind that doesn't care about anyone's assumptions, and that means something to us. If you saw something of yourself in this story, in the feeling of being dismissed before you've had the chance to show what you carry, in the patience required to keep doing the work when the room has already decided what you are, then this story did what it was supposed to do. Drop your city and your country in the comments. Let us see how far this story has traveled. Let us see how many different places are home to people who understand what it means to keep paying attention when nobody is watching. If this story moved you, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Not because the numbers matter, but because the right story at the right moment can change the direction of a life. And you might know someone who is standing exactly where Emily stood on that first morning in the parking lot. Uncertain, underestimated, not yet knowing what they're about to prove. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We build them carefully, the same way Emily built her shot, piece by piece, with patience, without shortcuts, for the people willing to stay until the end. The greatest distance is never the one between you and the target. It is the one between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. And that distance, unlike 1,600 meters of Colorado Plateau in a crosswind, has no fixed measurement. It is always shorter than you think. And the only thing standing between you and the other side of it is the decision to begin. Begin.